In today's lecture, you have Sir Philip Sidney. His defense of poetry, his apology for poetry, and Stephen Gosson's attack on poetry, and Sidney's rebuttal. Sir Philip Sidney lived a very short life. He was born in 1554 and he was killed in the battlefield at the age of just 32 in 1586. And within this short span of time, Sir Philip Sidney was a poet, he was a critic, he was a prose writer, as his well-famous book in prose, that is prose romance, Arcadia, and he was a courtier. He was a soldier and he died in the battleground. And there is a saying that when he was dying, he was having a bottle of water. But another soldier was also dying just beside him and he needed water more, and Sir Philip Sidney gave his bottle of water to that dying soldier and said that you need this bottle of water more than I do. Such was the character of Sir Philip Sidney, and that's why he is often cited as an archetype of the well-rounded Renaissance man. He is said to be the perfect Renaissance man. Perfect Renaissance man is Sir Philip Sidney because of having so many attributes, so many qualities. His talents were multifold, encompassing not only poetry and cultivated learning, but also the virtues of statesmanship and military service. He was born into an aristocratic family. He was eventually knighted. That's why you have the title Sir Philip Sidney. Because of his knighthood, he was knighted and held government appointments which included the governorship as well as the soldier. Right, he was posted in France as well for some time. Right, he died at the age of 32 while fighting for Queen Elizabeth. His friends included Edmund Spenser. Edmund Spenser is called the poet's poet, and Edmund Spenser dedicated his first poetic volume, The Shepherd's Calendar, to this person only. And when Sir Philip Sidney died, Edmund Spenser wrote a pastoral elegy in honor of Sir Philip Sidney under the title Astrophel. Right? Mr. Philip Sidney wrote The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, that was published in 1580. He wrote in 1581, and all his works were published after his death. And Sir Philip Sidney was the first writer who wrote a sonnet cycle. Under the title Astrophel and Stella. Astrophel and Stella was a sonnet cycle that he wrote in honor of his beloved. And he was original in producing sonnet cycle in English language, influenced by the Italian poet Petrarch, entitled Astrophel and Stella. It was also published after his death. So he was a poet, he was a courtier, and finally he became a critic. There was a critic, there was a failed poet, you could say, a failed dramatist, a Puritan who had attacked poetry on various grounds. And Sir Philip Sidney wrote a rebuttal to that attack. Sidney, courtier, soldier, diplomat and writer, and the defense of poesy was originally published under two different titles, the defense of poesy and an apology of poetry, and the two different titles were published by two different publishers. An apology for poetry was published by Olney. It was published by Olney, and the second one was published by Pansnoby, the defense of poesy, and this is a question of your examination UGC. Why the work has two different titles? Because of the two different publisher, and apology also stands for defense, and it was supposedly written in 1580-81 and published in 1595. Published in 1595 and written in 1580-81, the defense of poesy and apology for poetry. Now the two titles are given, an apology for poetry and defense of poesy. Defense of poesy. In defense of poesy, he forms his argument in a classical 7-part structure with an introduction and moving through the stages of proposition, division, examination, refutation to a final proportion, and including a custom permitted a digression on a related issue. This is the structure of the book. Sidney's Apology for Poetry is in many ways a seminal text of literary criticism. It is not only a defense but also one of the most acclaimed treatises on poetics of its time. As you know that there was no significant poetic criticism, there was no significant poetics was available for English writer and English poets, and it was Sir Philip Sidney who wrote a significant treatise. While its ideals are the ideas that Sir Philip Sidney talked about, that Sir Philip Sidney wrote in the book, is not original. It represents the first synthesis in English language of the various strands and concerns of Renaissance literary criticism, drawing on Aristotle, Horace, and more recent Italian writers like Boccaccio, a French writer Julius Caesar, and it raises issues such as the value and function of poetry. The issues that Sir Philip Sidney tackled: value of poetry. What should be the value of poetry? What should be the function of poetry? Why should anyone read a poem, and why should anyone write a poem? Right, the nature of imitation, right, as Aristotle had said about tragedy, and Sir Philip Sidney also copied that style. Poetry is the imitation of nature, as was said by Mr. Sir Philip Sidney, right. The concept of nature, which were to concern literary critics in numerous languages until the late 18th century. Sidney's writing of the Apology as a defense of poetry was occasioned by an attack. And who was that attacker? That attacker was Sir Stephen Gosson. This was the cover page of Stephen Gosson's book, and the name of the book, the name of the essay was The School of Abuse. The School of Abuse. This was the name of the text written by Stephen Gosson, containing a pleasant invective against poets, pipers, right? Poets, pipers, against he wrote an attack, right? And according to him, according to Sir Stephen Gosson, poetry is the mother of lies and poets are the father of liars, right? Poets, father of liars, poetry is the mother of lies, and Stephen Gosson said that Plato was very right when he banned poetry from his Utopia, the Republic. And Sir Philip Sidney answered these questions. Right, so Stephen Gosson was a Puritan minister. As mentioned earlier, Sidney rejects Gosson's Protestant attack on courtly pleasure. Right, courtly pleasure जो था उसको Stephen Gosson, what did he do? Stephen Gosson's allegations were refuted by Sir Philip Sidney in his work The Defense of Poesy. What were his allegations? Allegation number one was that poets as the father of lies. Poets as the father of lies, this was the allegation. Poetry is the mother of lies, this was the allegation. And apart from defense of poesy, Stephen Gosson had also written a treatise under the title Plays Confuted in 5 Accents. Plays Confuted in 5 Accents. This was another essay written by Stephen Gosson, and Stephen Gosson had attacked drama in this part of article in this essay. And Stephen Gosson had said that drama, what is drama? He argues that theatre has become a hunting ground for the prostitutes. Theatre had become hunting ground for the prostitutes, and theatre had become a place where every wanton and his paramour, every man and his mistress, every John and John, every knave and queens first meet and make their assignation. Drama, theatre is a place where different types of corrupt people meet first, and then they make their plan and leave the country or corrupt the various people. Hence, drama was spreading immorality. This was the main argument, main tenet of his criticism, and Sir Stephen Sidney also gave his rebuttal against the opinions. He attacked tragedies for their criminal subjects. Tragedy, subject matter of the tragedy is the criminal subject matter. Comedies, comedies were also attacked, as he said that comedies, their groundwork is love, cousin, flattery, bawdry, slight conveyance of whoredom, and their characters are cooks, queens, knaves, bards, parasites, and the lies. These were the comments of Sir Stephen Gosson. Right? Why do I say him so? Because he had done a Herculean task. The Puritans were already against literature, against poetry, but they could not muster the courage to write them down. And it was Sir Stephen Gosson who mustered the courage, who collected his courage to write such an attack. And then it was Sir Philip Sidney who replied him beautifully. Gosson had indicted poetry on 4 grounds. And those 4 grounds on which Mr. Gosson had concentrated: number 1, according to Gosson, a man could employ his time more usefully than read poetry. Why should anybody read poetry? There are various other things that could be enjoyed. Why should they waste time in reading poetry as they are spreading immorality? Number 2, that it is the mother of lies. Poetry is the mother of lies, right? There is no truth at all. And why should we read something that is not true, something that is not genuine, something that is not real? Why should poetry be read? This was the second allegation. Third allegation was that it is the nurse of abuse. Who? Poetry is the nurse of abuse. Means it nourishes wantonness, it nourishes wickedness, it nourishes vice, not virtues. Poetry is the nurse of abuse. It treats the vices. It promotes the sensuality. And finally and most significantly, he said that Plato had rightly banished poets from his ideal commonwealth. Plato had rightly banished poets from the commonwealth. These were the four grounds on which Stephen Gosson attacked poetry. Number one, that a man could employ his time more usefully than in poetry. Number two, poetry is the mother of lies. Number three, it nourishes the abuse. And number four, Plato was right when he banned poetry from his republic, when he banned poets from his republic. So these were the arguments, these were the allegations of Stephen Gosson. And Sir Philip Sidney responded, Sir Philip Sidney replied to these allegations in his work An Apology for Poetry or Essay for Poetry. Alright, essay of defense of poesy or apology for poetry. First defense of Sir Philip Sidney. First allegation, what was the first allegation? That a person can employ his time in a better way by doing different things rather than reading poetry. And Philip Sidney said that no learning is so good as that teaches and moves to virtue. There is nothing in the world, there is no learning in the world than that teaches and moves to virtue. Teach, move towards virtue. It is only poetry that can lead towards virtue, and none can teach virtue thereto as much as poetry. Poetry is the only thing that can teach virtue. That's why people should read poetry. Neither philosophy nor history can teach virtue, only poetry can, and that's why poetry must be read. Right? Poetry must be read. Homer, Hesiod, Livius, Aeneas, Dante, everybody gave his philosophy, his knowledge through poetry only. Neither philosophers nor historiographers could at first teach and move. Philosophers can deal only in abstract terms, and historian deals with facts only. They do not have the power to move. It is only poetry that can move us. That's why poetry should be read. Poetry is not as bad as Stephen Gosson had said, but poetry has the power to spread virtue in the society. This was the first defense of Sir Philip Sidney in his essay. Right? What was his second defense when he said that poetry was the mother of lies? Then Sir Philip Sidney says that poets are no liars. Poetry doesn't lie. And Philip Sidney says that it never lieth as it never affirmed. It never claims to be true. Poetry never claims to be true. Then how can it lie? It cannot be a lie as it never affirms. It never claims to be true, and once it never claims to be true, then you cannot say that it is a lie. It is far ahead. It is far beyond than truth and true and false. His answer to the second objection that poets are liars is that all writers under the sun, the poet is the least liar. The poet creates something by emotion or imagination against which no charge of lying can be brought. The astronomer, the geometrician, the historian and others all make false statements. But poet nothing affirms and therefore never lieth. This is the very important statement. Poet never nothing affirms, and therefore never lieth. Poet doesn't take the guarantee that it is true. Poet never takes the guarantee that it is false. Poet is beyond the structure of true and false. Right? Therefore never lieth, his end being to tell not what is or what is not, but what should or should not be. This is the function of a poet. This is the function of poetry. What does a poet do? Poet never claims it to be true. Number one, poet doesn't talk about what is good or what is bad. Poet talks about what it should be and what it should not be. Right? That is merely suggestion. That is merely advice. The question of truth or falsehood would arise only when a person insists on telling a fact. The poet does not present fact but fiction embodying truth of an ideal kind. Truth of an ideal kind की बात करता है पोएट, ना कि वो ट्रू एंड false की बात करता है. This is the second defense of Sir Philip Sidney, right? The defense of Sir Philip Sidney against that poetry is mother of lies. The third attack was poetry nourishes abuse. It nurses abuse. Then what does Philip Sidney says that the third objection against poetry, that it is the nurse of abuse, infecting us with many pestilent desires or wits, may be partly justified, but for this is a particular poet may be blamed, but not poetry. A poet could be a bad nurse, a poet could be a bad doctor. How can poetry be a bad doctor? Right? How can poetry treat abuse? A single person, a single poet may be a bad poet and he may treat abuse, he may spread abuse, not the entire poetry. To this charge, Sidney replies that poetry doesn't abuse man's wit, but it is man's wit that abuses poetry. It is man's wit that abuses poetry means it is a single poet. It is the single poet's wit that can abuse poetry. Poetry does not abuse man's wit. It is man's wit that abuses poetry. This is a very significant statement. All arts and sciences misused had evil effects, but that did not mean that they were less valuable when rightly employed. Abuse of poetry, according to Sidney, is not the problem of poetry but of the poet. Abuse of poetry is not the problem of poetry, but it is the problem of the poet. It is someone's false wit that can produce bad poetry. It doesn't mean that poetry itself is bad. The problem lies in the poet and in the false wit of the poet, not in the poetry itself. This was the third defense of poetry by Sir Philip Sidney. And then the ultimate attack of Sir Stephen Gosson was that Plato was very right when he banished poets from his republic, and on this attack Sir Philip Sidney says that Plato himself was a poet and Plato didn't ban poet or poetry, but he banned emotional poets. Right? Fourth objection, that Plato had rightly banished the poets from his ideal republic, is also not tenable, because Plato sought to banish the amoral poets. Not every poet, but Plato sought to banish the amoral poets of his time and not poetry itself. Plato himself believed that poetry is divinely inspired. Plato gives high and rightly divine commendation of poetry. His description of the poet as light-winged and sacred thing. This is the definition of poet given by Plato. Reveals his attitude to poetry. Sidney concludes, so as Plato, banishing the abuse, not the thing, but banishing but giving due honor unto it, shall be our patron and not adversary. Right? Plato made a difference between a good poet and bad poet, and Plato banished the bad poetry, not the good poetry. Right? Plato used poetic devices such as dialogue and description of setting and circumstances to adorn his philosophy. Alright, again, historians such as Herodotus have borrowed the fashion and the weight of poetry. Sidney concludes that neither philosopher nor historiographer could at the first have entered into the gates of popular judgments if they had not taken the great passport of poetry. Plato had the passport of poetry, Homer had the passport of poetry, and the knowledge that we have today has been derived from poetry itself. So how can anybody ban poetry from his republic? He banned a type of poetry, and in Aeon, a book written by Plato, he advocates that divine poets are always welcomed. Right, so this was the argument of Sir Philip Sidney. This was the defense of Sir Philip Sidney against the opinions, against the allegations imposed by Mr. Stephen Gosson. Alright, any confusion? What is poesy? Poesy doesn't only mean poetry, but according to Sir Philip Sidney, poesy means all types of fictitious works, whether prose or drama. That is poesy. So Sir Philip Sidney was not only defending poetry, but he was also defending drama as well as prose. All types of fictitious works were being defended by Sir Philip Sidney, and Sir Philip Sidney's essay, The Defense of Poesy, is said to be the first first work of literary criticism in English. First work of literary criticism in English. Right? That is the work of Sir Philip Sidney. And Mr. Stephen Gosson's essay, The School of Abuse, provoked two responses. The first response, that is also the work written by Thomas Lodge, and the name of that work is also The Defense of Poesy. It was published in 1579, right? Published in 1579, and Sir Thomas Lodge, one of the university wits, also defended poetry by saying that I reason not that all poets are holy, but I affirm that poetry is a heavenly gift. It doesn't come to one and all. It is a special gift given by God to selected people, not every people. This was the argument, this was the statement of Sir Thomas Lodge in his essay In Defense of Poesy. A heavenly gift, a perfect gift, than which I know not greater pleasure. Right? And there is nothing in the world that could give more pleasure than poetry. It is a heavenly gift. It doesn't come to all, but the God selects a few people for this heavenly gift. Alright, so this was the response of Sir Thomas Lodge. Next point, Stephen Gosson had dedicated his essay to Sir Philip Sidney. Without his response, without even asking Sir Philip Sidney, he dedicated the essay, the School of Abuse, Sir Philip Sidney. So Philip Sidney was compelled to complete to defend the poetry. Though Sir Philip Sidney never takes the name of Stephen Gosson in his defense, but he defended poetry against all the allegations imposed by Stephen Gosson. Right? And then Sir Philip Sidney was a perfect Renaissance man. He was a perfect humanist. So he gave the example of all the previous writers that he had read, like Homer, Hesiod, Plato, Aristotle, Livius, Ennius, Dante, Boccaccio, Petrarch, Pythagoras, Empedocles. Everybody is mentioned in his defense of English or defense of poetry. Right? Everybody is mentioned there. The defense of poesy and Renaissance humanism. Right? Renaissance humanism is also known as secular humanism. What is humanism? Humanism means man is in the center of the universe. Man is the maker of his own world. Before the Renaissance, it was said that everything is pre-decided. People are writing only divine poetry, only religious poetry, not humanistic poetry. And it was Sir Philip Sidney's attempt to write a humanistic work, and his essay, A Poesy for Poetry, is a humanistic criticism, is a secular work. Right? Definition of poesy that I told you. Poesy therefore is an art of imitation. Right? As Aristotle had defined tragedy, Sir Philip Sidney also defines poetry. Poesy therefore is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle termed it in his word mimesis. That as tragedy was the imitation, in the same way poesy is also an art of imitation. That is to say, it represents, it counterfeits or figures forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture. According to Sir Philip Sidney, poetry, what is poetry? Poetry is a speaking picture. Very, very important question. Poetry is a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. What was the main objective of Aristotle? For his tragedy, the main objective was catharsis, to entertain people. It was Horace who talked about the objectives of poetry. It should delight as well as teach. And here Mr. Philip Sidney was indebted to Horace and Aristotle in defining his poetry. It is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle termed it in his word mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture. A speaking picture with this end to teach and delight, and this is the main objective of poetry, to teach and to delight. Right? Imitation, it is an art of imitation. And according to Sir Philip Sidney, there are three kinds of poetry. There are three kinds of poetry: religious poetry, philosophical poetry, and imaginative poetry. Religious poetry is written to praise, to appreciate gods. Philosophical poetry is written to prophesy something, to philosophize something, and philosophical poetry could be of philosophical poetry imparts knowledge of philosophy, history, astronomy, etc. And right or true poetry, right or true poets, like the philosophical poets, bound by the subject matter they have to convey. And right poetry could be divided into heroic, elegiac, tragic, lyric, tragic, comic, satirical, pastoral, etc. These are the division given by Sir Philip Sidney. Right poetry division. The ancient Greek tradition of poetry is even more important for Sir Philip Sidney, providing access into his own view of connection between poetry and nature. Sidney reminds the reader that the Greek origin of the English word poet was the word P-O-E-I-N, peon, P-E-P-O-E, just a minute. This is the Greek origin of the word poet, and it means maker. Poet is a maker, and the maker has made a maker. God has made a maker. Right? So poet has the power to create something, to make something, as God has the power to create something, to make something. And there are, according to Sir Philip Sidney, three kinds of poetry: religious, philosophical, right or true, or imaginative poetry. Right? Philosophical poetry consists of a knowledge of philosophy, history, astronomy, etc. And true poetry has several types like heroic, elegiac, lyric, tragic, comic, satirical, pastoral. And Sir Philip Sidney adds that it is not rhyming and versing that makes a poet. Only rhyming and versification do not make someone a poet. It is feigning notable images of virtues, vices, or what else with that delightful teaching which must be the right describing note to know a poet by. A poet should be known by his characteristics. And what should be his characteristics? According to Sir Philip Sidney, he must be a rhymer, he must be a versifier, and he must be writing something delightful. He should teach something delightfully. Not versification is sufficient, but teaching is also mandatory, which must be the right describing note to know a poet by. These are the attributes. Poet must be writing something delightfully, and that delight must also teach. It means teaching is mandatory for a poet. And then Sir Philip Sidney says that a poet has rivals, and poet has two rivals, philosopher and historians. Philosophers and historians two rivals हैं, and historian, what does a historian do? Historian is also a teacher, and a historian teaches by example without precept, and a philosopher teaches precept without example. Just understand the line. A historian teaches with examples without precept. A poet, a historian doesn't have to say anything about future. He doesn't have anything to say about future. He has various examples of the past. And a philosopher has precepts. He has the knowledge. He has something to convey for the future, but he doesn't have examples. It means both are the failed. Both are failures. Nobody has the power to convey something about future. It is only poet who can supersede a historian as well as a philosopher. Poets have the ability to remember and paint the past while philosophizing about the future. A historian talks about the past only, and a philosopher talks about the future only. Nobody talks about the present. It is the poet who has the power to go in the past, who has the power to be in the present, and who has the power to be in the future. All these characteristics comprises in a poet. So a poet is far better than a philosopher, than a historian. Alright. Poetry represents an artistic perspective of both. इसलिए poet is the boss of everyone. Poet gets the first place because of his characteristics, because of his ability to be in the past, to paint the past, and to envision future. Alright. Poet is someone who is not captivated to the truth of foolish world. The poet can ensure that virtue is rewarded and vice punished. This is the poetic justice. This is the poetic justice. Not captivated to the truth of a foolish world, the poet can ensure virtue is rewarded and vice punished. Moreover, the poet is able to bring to his instructive task the power to move. The first task of the poet is to delight, instructively delight, and the second is to move, and only poet has the capacity, has the ability to move the audience, which is far more effective means of persuasion than cold instruction. Merely giving instruction, merely prescribing something is not sufficient. But there is a but. What is more effective? When entertainment mixes with teaching. For the poet comes to you with what delights and entrances holds children from play and old men from the chimney's corner. This was the opinion of Sir Philip Sidney. Who is the poet in the words of Sir Philip Sidney? Then Sir Philip Sidney defines that the Greek origin of the word poet was the word poen, meaning to make. Greek origin means make. Man is maker, a poet. His ability derives him from his heavenly maker. Nature never set forth the earth in so rich tapestry as diverse poets have done. Nature is not above poet. A poet can go beyond nature. Her world is brazen. Whose world? Nature's world is brazen. Nature's world is infertile. Nature's world doesn't have the productivity. But poet's world, poets only deliver a golden. Poet's world is golden. Alright, poets का जो वर्ल्ड है ये गोल्डन है और जो वर्ल्ड है पोएट का वो ब्रेजन लैंड है. Poet is the food for the tenderest stomachs. A philosopher's philosophy is obscure. It is not understandable for one and all, but it is the poet only who is the softest food, and poetry could be digested by anyone, by one and all. Poet is indeed the right popular philosopher. Poet is a poet, poet is a philosopher, and poet's words are very simple to be understood by the common man. Philosopher talks in obscure terms, in strange terms. A historian talks in past only, but it is the poet who could be understood by everyone, by one and all. Alright, this is about the poet. And then what is poetry? And in defining poetry, once again Sir Philip Sidney goes to Aristotle and he defines poetry in Aristotelian terms. Aristotle के terms में poetry को फिर define करता है. Poetry is philosophetron and spoditarian. These are the two Greek words given by Aristotle. That is to say, just note down these two words. It is more philosophical and more studiously serious than history. Right? More philosophical poetry is more philosophical and more studiously serious than history. Sidney cites Aristotle's view that poetry deals with the kathalo, means universal, whereas history concerns the kathikastin and it means particular. Poetry is universal and history is not universal, but history is particular. History particular. The particular is constrained by what actually happened, whereas the universal comprehends action or words. Poetry is universal, history is particular. History talks about a particular person, a particular age, a particular person, a particular time, but poet is universal. He talks about one and all, and he talks about everything simultaneously. So poetry is greater, and Sir Philip Sidney didn't write all these things alone. As I said initially, he was indebted to several artists, several philosophers, several scholars, several poets of the past, and I have given here only two names who inspired Sir Philip Sidney's critical treatise, A Defense of Poesy. First work is was written by Antonio Mintorinos, and the work was De Poetica, and the second work was written by Julius Caesar Scaliger, a French philosopher, a French scholar, and his books was the Poetics. Right, so these were the two books that inspired Sir Philip Sidney while writing the essay Apology for Poetry. Alright, so these were the opinions expressed by Sir Philip Sidney, and now I come to the questions asked by UGC MCQs, जिसको आप बोलते हो क्या, PYQs, previous year questions. Alright, now I am reading the question and you have to answer one by one. The first question is here on your screen. Read the question and write the answer in your comment box. I'll be waiting for your answers. Philip Sidney defended poetry against such descriptions of it as the mother of lies and the nurse of abuse. His main argument here is, what is the argument of Sir Philip Sidney? While defending poetry as the mother of lies or the nurse of abuse, you have read these two allegations and Mr. Philip Sidney's reply, and now you have to write your answer. Options are here. The poet is no conjurer or illusionist and represents a world. The poet cannot lie because he is not claiming to tell us the truth. The poet cannot speak the truth because he is not representing the real world. And the poet is a philosopher for whom truth is a lie and lie truth is an imaginary world. These are the four options to the question. What are the main ground of Sir Philip Sidney when he defended poetry against the allegations that poetry is the mother of lies and it nurses abuse? What did Sir Philip Sidney say? You know the answer. I am not going to tell the answer, but without telling the answer, I cannot be. Right? I have to tell. I am forced to tell the answer, and you know the answer very well. The answer to this question is B. The poet cannot lie because he is not claiming to tell us the truth. Poetry, it never lies as it never affirms. As it never affirms means it never claims to be true. Alright, next question. How all their plays be neither right tragedies nor right comedies, mingling kings and clowns, not because the matter so carrieth it, but thrust in the clown by head and shoulders to play a part in majestical matters. What term does Philip Sidney use to characterize such plays, and which of the unities of Aristotle do they violate? One more thing I want to clarify here. Aristotle was a classical here. Aristotle believed in Aristotle's unity of action, time and place. And Sir Philip Sidney was very sad when he found that the people, the poet of his era was not as good as the poets of the classical time. Right? Sir Philip Sidney was also a critic of the drama of the time. Right? He also criticized drama of the time, and he said that poets, dramatists are not following the right direction. Right direction भी dramatists follow नहीं कर रहे, so he had attacked drama as well before his defense, and he categorized drama as he had categorized poetry. So what is his opinion? Which type of play is this? Now he talks about the mongrel tragic comedies and Aristotle's violation of Aristotle's unity of action. What is mongrel tragic comedy Philip Sidney was of the opinion that a play should be either a tragedy or a comedy, right? And they should not be intermingled, they should not be mixed. हाँ mix किए भी जा सकते हैं when it is जो है बिल्कुल exceptional case हो तो, otherwise in normal cases there should be no mixturing. Clowns and kings are not suitable at the same stage, and that will be merely what? Mongering, right? That is, he calls mongrel tragic comedy. Next question. In his defense of poesy, what is the best and most accomplished kind of poetry in Sidney's estimation? Sidney divides poetry into three parts. थ्री पार्ट्स की पोएट्री डिवाइड है. कौन कौन सी वो थ्री पार्ट्स हैं? ही टॉक्स अबाउट रिलीजियस पोएट्री, फिलोसॉफिकल पोएट्री एंड इमेजिनेटिव पोएट्री, एंड द हाईएस्ट स्टेटस दैट ही गिव्स टू heroical or epic poetry. In defense of poesy, what arguments does Sidney make for considering the biblical Psalms poetry? Biblical Psalms poetry means religious poetry, and Sir Philip Sidney says that Jesus Christ himself expressed his opinion in poetry. So how can poetry be mother of lies? How can poetry nourishes abuse? Right? They are written in meter, they originated in church choirs, they were written by single author. David uses imagery and personification to portray faith. Right? It was David, right, who used imagery and personification to portray faith, and poetry is written in meter, and answer to this question is C, first and fourth. Right? It is David uses imagery and personification to portray faith, and poetry is written in meter as well. As Sidney argues in defense of poesy, which discipline is more useful and praiseworthy, history or poetry? And you know the answer. You do not need to even read the options. Right? Which one is better, history or poetry? History, being captivated to truth, is more useful than poetry. Poetry, where men can see virtue exalted and vice punished, is more useful than history. History is more useful for poetry, is an encouragement to unbridled wickedness. History and poetry are synonymous, and so both are useful. Sir Philip Sidney says that poetry is something that virtue is exalted and vice is punished, that is poetic justice. So the obvious answer is B. Philip Sidney wrote an apology for poetry in immediate response to Stephen Gosson's The School of Abuse. Stephen Gosson's School of Abuse was written in 1579, and it was dedicated to Sir Philip Sidney. And in response to that essay, in response to the School of Abuse, Sir Philip Sidney wrote his defense of poesy. Next question. In the defense of poetry, what did Sidney attribute to poetry? What did Sidney attribute to poetry? A magical power where poetry plays tricks on the reader. A divine power where poetry transmits a message from God to the reader. A moral power where poetry encourages the reader to evaluate virtuous models. A realistic power that cannot be made to seem like mere illusion and trickery. This is a tricky question, and UGC sometimes asks tricky questions, and one of the tricky questions: in defense of poetry, what did Sidney attribute to poetry? Poetry has a divine power whereby poetry transmits a message from God to reader. This is the answer, as Mr. Philip Sidney says that poet is a maker and God is also a maker. So poet is equivalent to God, and a divine power whereby poetry transmits a message from God to the reader. In the defense of poesy, Sidney says, now as in geometry, the oblique must be known as well as right, and in arithmetic, the odd as well as the even. So in the actions of our life, who seeth not the filthiness of evil, maintains a great foil to perceive the beauty of virtue. Which of the following forms of poesy offers a foil that helps us perceive the beauty of virtue? And for this he gives the example of comedy. In his defense of poesy, which of the following works does Sidney commend as good examples of English poesy? Good examples of English poesy according to Sir Philip Sidney are two only. Right? First he talks about Edmund Spenser's Shepherd Calendar, and then he talks about the poetic anthology of The Mirror of Magistrates. The Mirror of Magistrates, when was it published? You have to search the answer. When was The Mirror of Magistrates published? And the Shepherd's Calendar was dedicated to Sir Philip Sidney, and Sir Philip Sidney was one of the first appreciator of the poem. What does Philip Sidney call poet haters in his defense of poesy? In his defense of poesy, which of the following terms talks about the poet haters? Misogynist is one who hates women. Misanthrope are those people who hates human being. And here is a special word that means poet haters, and this word is this: misomocy. Misomocy is the word which means the poet haters. Alright. Next question. What in sum is Sidney's point in the following? Nature never set forth the earth in so rich tapestry as diverse poets have done, neither with pleasant rivets, fruitless trees, sweet smelling flowers, not whatsoever else may make the too much loved earth more lovely. Her world is brazen, the poets deliver only golden. Right, just 5 minutes ago or 10 minutes before, we talked about this statement: poet's world is golden and nature's world is brazen. What does he want to convey? These are the options. Works of art are superior to the natural world they represent. Works of art can often compete with the natural world represented by them. Neither the poets nor the natural world set forth equal nature's rich tapestry. The natural world is far superior to the works of art that represent it. You have to tell the answer, and I am not going to tell the answer of this question. I will be waiting for your answer in the comment box. Poetry according to Sir Philip Sidney is of three kinds. They are the simplest question. Three kinds of poetry, and the three kinds of poetry are given here. You have to pick the right answer. Religious, dramatic, romantic, classical, romantic, neoclassical, philosophical, imaginative, narrative, religious, philosophical and imaginative. Three kinds of poetry that Sir Philip Sidney discusses in his A Defense of Poesy. The right answer to this question is, once again in comment box. Then thank you. Thank you for showing your patience. This is one of the most important chapters, one of the most important pieces of criticism for UGC NET aspirants. You have to be very serious and you have to watch this video twice or thrice, and at least one question will be there in your UGC examination of December. If you are preparing seriously, you cannot miss this chapter, nor you can miss these questions that I have just discussed here. Right, this is very, very significant chapter, and if you have understood all the points, please convey your feedback through message, and if you are satisfied, then please keep on watching, sharing, and एक like तो बनता है ना, थैंक यू सो मच, ऑल द बेस्ट। मिलते हैं जल्दी नेक्स्ट चैप्टर पर, एंड नेक्स्ट चैप्टर इज ऑन John Dryden as a critic. You know that Dryden was a dramatist, Dryden was a poet, and Dryden was a satirist. Dryden was the first poet laureate of England, and Dryden is better known as a critic. I will discuss the points that were written by John Dryden in different prefaces of his plays and in his most significant essay on dramatic poesy. All right, thank you, all the best। मिलते हैं बहुत जल्दी नेक्स्ट वीडियो में। तब तक इस वीडियो को वॉच करते रहिए, शेयर करते रहिए। बाय बाय, टेक केयर, गुड लक।